What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Modern video. And we are just less than 2 weeks away from Modern Horizons 3 being released into the format and further shaking up the Modern format and kind of doing what Modern Horizons sets have always done, and that's injecting super playable cards into the format. And I got a few here that I'm pretty excited about that I want to go over and I want to talk about in depth and kind of give some things that I like about it, some things that I don't like, some possible synergies, and some places that we could potentially see these cards seeing play. But of course, before we get into any of the cards and we talk about anything from Modern Horizons 3, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos where we do a lot of Modern and Pioneer content, along with some other longer form videos and even a podcast as well, please consider subscribing to the channel and ring the notification bell so you know when those videos get posted, as it is a free, easy way to support me and my content. With that said, let's go ahead and take a look at our first card from Modern Horizons 3 that I think could be a pretty key player in the format. So first things first here, I'm going to lump these two together as they are the quote-unquote 2 mana lands from the set in Ugin's Labyrinth and Phyrexian Tower. So we're going to start with Ugin's Labyrinth first, just because this is the new card of the two, as Phyrexian Tower is a reprint in the set. So Ugin's Labyrinth is a land that has imprint that says when it enters the battlefield, you may exile a colorless card with mana value 7 or greater from your hand. Then it has tap to add a colorless mana. If a card is exiled with Ugin's Labyrinth, you add 2 colorless instead, and then you can tap and return an exiled card, the exiled card, to its owner's hand. So when you play Ugin's Labyrinth, at worst, you're going to have a land that you're not going to exile anything with, and it's going to tap for a colorless mana. That isn't really exciting. And of course, like, the second ability is not going to really do a whole lot for you. But with Ugin's Labyrinth, you can have like that upside of, exiling a colorless card with mana value 7 or greater, put it into your hand. So this is going to accomplish kind of like a few things. So one, Ugin's Labyrinth, you essentially 2-for-1 yourself for a land that is going to be able to add 2 mana, presumably, on the turn you play it, which I'm not going to act like isn't a huge deal. I mean, it's kind of like both in a way where, Chrome Mox was like a way that you could play a card, and then you like exile a card, you 2-for-1 yourself, and you could tap to add a color of mana, not even any color of mana, but a color of mana to the card that you actually exiled. So with Ugin's Labyrinth, you have to exile that card, and it's going to be a high-costed colorless card that then you're going to be able to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool, and you're going to be able to get that card back later once you kind of get enough lands to kind of get things going. So something I can see with Ugin's Labyrinth, this being played in Tron, of course, where we're going to see, Tron being assembled. This is like a way that if it doesn't have, mine or tower or whatever, it can get, you can exile one of your big finishers, kind of protect it from like Thoughtseize and from some of the scam stuff that is going on in the format. And you'll be able to get that card back later once you assemble Tron, or once you kind of get enough lands put into play to where you can kind of get it back and then potentially cast it to, again, kind of keep it protected from some of the discard spells and whatnot. In a format where there is a ton of Boseiju running around in just about any of the green decks, as well as, decks just kind of killing you really, really fast, Ugin's Labyrinth is kind of in a weird spot. It's going to be good at producing 2 colorless mana in the decks that want to play a lot of the big Eldrazi and stuff, or even some of the big colorless spells in the format, or even some of the X spells as well. But some of those X spells aren't going to be very good if they're the only colorless cards in your hand, because, X is always 0 on a card until you're casting it, and then it's whatever you cast it for. So it's not really going to benefit anything from Ugin's Labyrinth, even though you are going to be able to play some of those double X spells, on turn 1. So Ugin's Labyrinth definitely finds itself in a weird spot. This could also find a home in Affinity as well, because a lot of, the Sojourner's Companions, the Mirror Enforcers, and even the Frogmite Enforcer, whatnot, like those, there's like 12 cards there that are technically colorless cards. You're not going to be able to get around Thought Monitor, because it doesn't have Devoid, and it does have a blue mana symbol in its cost, so you're not going to be able to exile that card. But with those having like 12, potentially 16 cards that are colorless that are going to cost 7 or more mana, which is a way that you can kind of skirt around like the cost of those cards, because they're eventually going to be cast for a fair bit less than 7 mana. So we could see Ugin's Labyrinth in some of these big mana decks where it's going to want that early mana production. And of course, on the flip side of it as well, getting to kind of protect some of its high mana cards from being thought seized and or scammed out of their hand, and then the ability to kind of get them back later and then play them at a time where it's convenient. So Ugin's Labyrinth definitely falls in like that weird category of where like it's probably either going to be super busted, and like the drawback, quote unquote, is going to be, you know, not a thing you're worried about. Where, you know, on the other hand, it could absolutely be a detriment to this card and kind of be the reason why Ugin's Labyrinth doesn't see more play than it should. You know, we know that 2 mana lands come at a premium. You know, we have Eldrazi Temple that taps for 2 colorless mana, but only to cast Eldrazi spells, or maybe even activate abilities, but I know for a fact it's spells. You know, we have Ancient Tomb and City of Traders in Legacy, you know, where City of Traders makes you sack it if you play another land. Ancient Tomb deals you damage and whatnot. You know, Ugin's Labyrinth, potentially, again, with all the very powerful colorless spells and some of the ones that end up making themselves cost less, can make Ugin's Labyrinth pretty playable in conjunction with like some other early aggressive colorless threats to kind of, you know, abuse the mana early, and then when you get to a point where you've made your land drops, maybe you assemble Tron, whatever, or you just need that spell underneath Ugin's Labyrinth, you're able to get it back with the Labyrinth's own ability and then end up casting it. So that's kind of my thoughts on Ugin's Labyrinth. It's one of those cards that to me is in the middle, in that weird territory of like, this has the potential and the makings to be a very powerful card, but it's just going to depend on how fast the format is, how the format is going to react, and what exactly decks pick this up. I think it's more likely that Affinity does pick this up because it already has like 12 7-mana cards that it could play that are not actually 7-mana cards if you really think about it. You know, so I think this is an easy slot in, and I think you could have Tron decks that maybe play a little bit bigger in the main board, maybe less Karn, Karn the Great Creator, and more of like the big haymakers already in the main, because you're going to be able to have, you know, potentially 16 lands in your deck that produce at least 2 mana. And like I said, this one making your hand kind of safe from Thoughtseize in a weird way is pretty nice. Downside being, of course, you know, Besaju's running around and people potentially playing different kinds of like land destruction and whatnot to kind of disrupt what Ugin's Labyrinth is able to accomplish. So, you know, that's how I feel about Ugin's Labyrinth. Let's go ahead talk about Phyrexian Tower here. So Phyrexian Tower is a legendary land that taps for a colorless mana, and then you can tap it and sacrifice a creature to then add 2 black mana to your mana pool. So again, this is a land that falls into that 2 mana category of producing land. You know, it is going to, you know, give you a way to, you know, have a sack outlet in a weird way, and we know that there are some pretty good ways of, you know, getting death triggers in the format, you know, where we can sacrifice like things like Citrus Supplier, we can end up milling cards, and then of course producing 2 black mana, so giving us like 3 mana on turn 2, which is really nice and can definitely, you know, you can do a lot with 3 mana when you're kind of like these graveyard based decks, especially again like on the early turns of the game. The only awkwardness that comes from something like a Phyrexian Tower, where, you know, sacrificing creature, you're kind of incentivized to play, you know, persist / undying creatures. You're kind of like want creatures that want to die in the deck, and then you want to be able to do something with the mana. You are going back to like playing at least, you know, 1, 2, 3 colors. At least with Ugin's Labyrinth, if you decide you're not going to exile something, at worst, it's a land that taps for a colorless mana in a deck where, you know, colored mana probably isn't really, you know, a big deal. And you're not playing it for it to produce colorless mana, or for colored mana, excuse me. You're playing Ugin's Labyrinth to produce colorless mana. You know, where Phyrexian Tower, yeah, like you want the 2 black. So you're kind of in this weird pattern where you kind of want to be a deck that isn't too mana intensive in terms of like the colors if you're looking to play multiple copies of Phyrexian Tower, where something like Ugin's Labyrinth is a non-legendary land, so you're able to play all 4 copies and ensure that you have them. Where Phyrexian Tower, when you start playing, you know, 2, 3, 4 copies, and with how lean mana bases are in Modern, there is a chance that Phyrexian Tower comes up where it's like the only land in your hand and you have a handful of colored spells and you have a Phyrexian Tower where you just have no way of getting a creature on the board to actually have this produce mana, and not only that, be able to get, you know, the mini ramp that it gives you by sacking a creature. I think Phyrexian Tower is going to be a pretty good land in the format. I think, you know, there's going to be a build for this. You know, have I figured it out? Am I going to be able to figure it out? Absolutely not. Phyrexian Tower is this weird card that, you know, when we've seen it come up and we've seen it be good, it's been very good. And there's time, like formats that it's in where it's kind of irrelevant. I don't really see it too much in Legacy, even though I'm not necessarily like a huge Legacy gamer, but there is, there were decks that would kind of abuse the fact that Phyrexian Tower could sacrifice creatures, and then you'd get mana, and then something like Veteran Explorer, you'd end up getting 2 more lands, and you'd be able to cast like 5 mana spells on like turn 2 or whatever, which is what kind of people were hoping for with like the flare cycle of like free spells, which we'll get into here in a minute. So overall, Phyrexian Tower does have some awkwardness that it kind of carries with it. Being legendary, only able to produce colorless if you don't have a creature to sacrifice. But again, kind of with like the pedigree and some of the standards that it's set and some of the results that it's put up in other formats, I'm inclined to believe that Phyrexian Tower somehow has a home in the modern format. Whether it's going to be a deck that is going to abuse the fact that you can sacrifice the creatures, and then like the mana is kind of like a bonus on top of the death triggers or anything like that, or being able to again sacrifice creatures to then generate 2 mana to then kind of ramp you up into some other spells that are going to kind of help you either with your own graveyard or just casting more powerful like creature spells or cards that care about death or whatever in the earlier turns of the game. So those are like the 2 mana like land cycle of cards. I mean, I can't really call it a cycle because it's 2 cards, but both of them doing something very different from one another to get you that 2 mana, and definitely both requiring different deck construction essentially. So it's interesting to see where these are going to slot in. Kind of sweet that we have, an older card in Phyrexian Tower and then a brand new one in Ugin's Labyrinth that I'm pretty excited to kind of see how those cards impact the format, because I think they do have the very big potential to impact the format. And as mythic rares in the set, they absolutely should. So that's my thoughts on the lands. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next, probably the most exciting cycle and what we come to expect from the Modern Horizons sets is the free spell cycle. So let's go ahead and look at those cards. So next we have the Flare cycle of cards. We have Flare of Fortitude, Flare of Denial, Flare of Malice, Flare of Duplication, and Flare of Cultivation. So these are all spells that you may sacrifice a non-token creature of that color to cast the spells, or to cast a spell without paying its mana cost. So for like Flare of Fortitude, you can either pay 2 and 2 white, or you can sacrifice a non-token white creature rather than play the spell's mana cost. So Flare of Fortitude, until end of turn, your life total can't change, and permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible. So that your life total can't change, and permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible. Flare of Denial counters a target spell if you sacrifice a non-token blue creature, or you pay 1 in double blue. For 2 in double black for Flare of Malice, or sacrificing a non-token black creature, each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker with the greatest mana value among creatures and planeswalkers they control. Flare Duplication for 1 in double red, and either that or sacrificing a non-token red creature. Copy target instant or sorcery spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. Or Flare of Cultivation for 1 in double green for a sorcery as well, which is the only sorcery of the cycle. And sacrificing a non-token green creature. You may search your library for up to 2 basic land cards. Reveal those cards. Put one of them into the battlefield. Tap the other into your hand. Then shuffle. So I think it's kind of hard to evaluate this cycle in terms of, compared to, the Force cycle that we got in Modern Horizons 1, and then the Elemental cycle that we got in Modern Horizons 2. And this is what we've kind of come to expect from these sets, is to have some kind of, spell that has an alternate casting cost, which essentially makes it free. And honestly, I think Flare of Duplication is the worst one, which is the red one to copy an instant or sorcery spell. And I don't even think that that's necessarily like the worst effect in the world either. I think Flare of Malice definitely has a pretty good place to play. Again, the fact that it's an instant, and like all these are instants except for, the one that is a Cultivate clone, I guess. You're going to be able to place the instant speed and be able to kind of interact with what your opponent has going on. So like Flare of Malice, we know that the Leyline decks plus, Domain and whatnot, playing like Scion of Draco. Scion of Draco is going to be the biggest thing on the board, like mana cost wise. Like, even though it's going to cost 2 mana to play it, it's always going to cost 12 CMC. So like Flare Malice is always going to be able to kill those creatures, and really anything that's like kind of huge is going to be beating you down. Even if, against like 4 and 5 color control, you're going to be able to end up tagging their and be able to tag like their Omnats and their things like that. Flare of Malice really a lot of the time is just going to end up killing the big creature because that's just what it does, and your opponent has to sacrifice it as well. So it plays around, hexproof on your opponent, and it plays around, hexproof and indestructible on those creatures as well, like especially on like their big threats, which again is pretty good when we're looking at like Leyline of the Guild Pact and Scion of Draco. Flare Denial, I think, is just expected to be the best one because it's just, essentially a free counterspell if you sacrifice a non-token blue creature. I think that there is some potential here where we could see some like flash blue creatures that have a little bit of utility, but then can also kind of get sacrificed to Flare of Denial. Will end up being pretty nice. Flare of Cultivation, there's some green creatures that you could kind of benefit from some death triggers as well as just getting to ramp for free as well. This does get a little bit worse, as you kind of play, but the fact that, again, this will kind of ramp. There are some pretty neat death things that we can do in blue or in black, or my goodness, in green, excuse me. So Flare of Cultivation, I think, is kind of like in the middle. I think Flare Denial and like Flare of Malice are kind of, the 1 and 2 of the best. I think Flare of Cultivation is kind of where you have to kind of like draw the line. Like, is it better than Flare of Cultivation? Now, I don't think Flare of Duplication or Fortitude are on that level, where I could definitely see Flare of Fortitude being a card that is either going to be a pretty huge blowout where your opponent's going to like kill one of your white creatures anyway, and then you just sack it to like play this, and it's like they essentially have no way of being able to really react, or if they're swinging for game, like you can just sack a creature, your life total can't change, your permanents have hexproof and indestructible, so then you're able to kind of like block, maybe like trade off with, or not even really trade off, like kill their board. And then, they're able to like untap and potentially kill your opponent, or just gain so much tempo from it that the game is just kind of over from there. I think Flare of Duplication and Flare of Fortitude need a little bit more to be very powerful, where I think Flare Denial, Flare of Malice, and Flare of Cultivation don't really need a whole lot going on for them to be good, where I think Flare of Malice, even as like an instant speed like Edict on your opponent's like highest CMC thing, isn't really the worst thing in the world, and like casting Flare Denial as like a cancel, or even Flare of Cultivation as a cultivate with a little bit more of a restrictive mana cost, isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. Where I think like Flare of Fortitude and Flare of Duplication, are also probably fine to just like hard cast, but like sacrificing things and having those scenarios where they're good, it's just kind of like whatever to me. So to me, like the Flare cycle is kind of exciting, but again, I think there is some that are just better than others, and I think, we're at Flare of Malice, Denial, and Cultivation are kind of like the best ones you're looking at, where like the white one definitely is pretty situational, and Flare of Duplication is like another one where you can kind of have some sick things where you kind of copy a powerful instant or sorcery, and you're essentially getting to do it for free and that sort of thing. But there's not too many big instant or sorcery spells that end up winning the game that you're going to be playing. So Flare Duplication is probably the worst one in my eyes, but that's kind of how I feel about the Flare cycle. I could definitely see any one of these 5 just kind of finding a home in Modern, and again, like finding the scenarios where they're absolutely cracked, and it just depends on how often that those scenarios are going to come up. So we'll kind of see as we go on. So that is the Flare cycle for Modern Horizons. Let's go ahead and look at some other exciting cards that are in the set. So next we have Necro Dominance, which is a retrain on the card Necropotence, to where I don't know if people probably have not had a chance to really play with like Necropotence, because like the only format that I think is really legal in, where it's probably still pretty decent, is something like Commander. But Necro Dominance is essentially the fix for Necropotence, which I don't know if there's really a good fix for Necropotence, but we have it now. So Necro Dominance is a triple black for a legendary enchantment. You skip your draw step, which is just like the original card Necropotence. At the beginning of your end step, you may pay any amount of life. If you do, you draw that many cards. Your maximum hand size is 5, and if a card or token would be put into your graveyard from anywhere, you exile it instead. So a few things with Necro Dominance we need to keep in mind. It's legendary because there is some scenarios, and I was wondering why, like basically being legendary doesn't really matter. If it was not legendary, because like the original Necropotence isn't. If this wasn't legendary, you could have 2 of these in play, and you could have like a Shieldred. Say you're at 10 life, you're like, okay, I'm going to pay 9 life, draw 9 cards. You're going to end up drawing 9 cards. You're going to get 9 triggers from Shieldred, which means you're going to gain 18 life, go up to 19. And then when you go to resolve your other Necrodominance trigger, you can then draw 18 cards and whatnot. And I mean, at that point, you know, you have different ways where you could, you know, increase your maximum hand size, where you something like Reliquary Tower, Thought Vessel, whatever, you know, you could, you know, make it so you don't have a hand size, which means that you could then end up drawing all those cards and be in pretty good shape. Now, is that something that's going to happen in Modern? Absolutely not. I don't see anybody playing, you know, Reliquary Tower to get around like Necrodominance, considering that that Reliquary Tower is not going to help you cast Necrodominance on turn 3 or even sooner. Token cards and or non-token cards going to the battlefield, or not going to the graveyard, you know, just getting exiled, means that you're going to miss out on death triggers. It means that you can't just say, okay, I have 15 life, I'm going to draw 10 cards, you know, have like 12, 13 cards in hand, and then discard 8 of them, and then now I have like a fully stocked graveyard for something where I'm going to absolutely be able to go off with it. Necrodominance is going to stop that right away. Even generating tokens and them dying, you're not going to get any death triggers or anything like that. So why exactly is Necrodominance a good card still? Well, again, for one, you know, as we pointed out, Necrodominance with Shieldred, especially in like something like Mono Black Coffers, is absolutely insane, because you're just going to be able to draw, you know, however many cards. Even if you have 0 cards in hand, but you're at like 10 life, you pay 5 life, you draw 5 cards, which I think the correct is like to draw at least 6 or 7 cards. You know, you go down to 3, but then, you know, you say you draw 7 cards, you go down to 3, but then you gain 14, so you're at 17 life. You know, you're discarding 2 cards and they're going to get exiled, but like you have 7 cards to pick from to build a awesome 5-card hand to then go into your next turn and hopefully just kind of dump your whole hand and do it all over again. You know, Necrodominance is going to hinge, I think, on how good Shieldred is in the format, just at a base level, because I think that's where people are going to start, is Necrodominance plus Shieldred, or other ways to get copies of Shieldred in play, or what have you, so you can continue to kind of abuse Necrodominance in this way. Outside of that, you know, we've seen Necropotence be a very good card. You know, there's definitely ways that you play with Necropotence. I think some of those same ways you kind of take into account with Necrodominance. You just take it, you know, with kind of a grain of salt. Yes, we know that Bowmaster is a card that exists in the format. Bowmaster is absolutely going to suck if you go and try to Necro for a few cards and, you know, your opponent ends up like, you know, where you want to do it in a spot where it's kind of obvious where you want to do it, or there's just kind of this Bowmaster sticking around, you know, it's going to end up causing a lot of damage to you if you try to draw a bunch of cards. Thankfully, with how Necrodominance triggers worked, you may pay any amount of life. So it's not like this triggers, your opponent says, okay, and then you're like, okay, I'm going to draw 7 cards while you're at 10, and then your opponent's like, okay, well, before that happens, I'm going to play Bowmaster. They have to play Bowmaster before you choose an amount of life to pay for Necrodominance. So at least for one turn, you know, you can kind of get a feel for what your opponent's doing. You know, if they decide that like, okay, well, I'm going to Bowmaster after you pick, it's like, well, no, I get to pick, and, you know, that Bowmaster basically has to wait until, you know, I draw my cards and everything, and I finish resolving this trigger before they can play it, which then, you know, they're not going to get a ton of counters on like their Orc army and things like that. So, you know, there is kind of like that little bit of upside with Necrodominance. You know, again, you're not going to be able to draw a ton of cards and then pitch a ton of cards to your graveyard unless you're somehow able to like draw a bunch of cards of Necrodominance and then like get this off the battlefield and then just be able to, you know, to go back up to 7-card hand size and then discard, you know, whatever else. Like there is some scenarios where you could, if you're playing like black-white, you could like march your own Necrodominance, get it out of here, you know, end up drawing a bunch of cards. So like now you have a 7-card, you know, hand limit instead of 5, you know, now you're sitting with like 10 cards in hand, you're just carding 3 instead of 5, or, you know, potentially just leaving yourself with more cards to kind of play with and, you know, do your own thing, which, you know, again, I could see doing something where you have like a Shieldred in play, you Necrodominance, draw a ton of cards, you end up gaining, you know, an amount of life, you know, for the amount of cards that you drew, because that's essentially how it ends up working out. And then just getting rid of Necrodominance, and then you're able to kind of like stock up your graveyard if that's the kind of thing that you're doing, or you're able to, again, keep extra cards in hand. So then you're able to, you know, potentially just play another Necrodominance on your turn. And again, something like a Cabal Coffers deck, just play a Necrodominance and then just be able to draw a bunch of cards again, gain a ton of life, and then get rid of your Necro, and then you just, again, keep another great 7-card hand and potentially just keep doing it over and over again. So is that something that is absolutely going to happen? Of course not. But I think Necrodominance is a card that is interesting enough that players are going to kind of experiment with this and kind of see where things go, because I think Necrodominance can be a potentially powerful card in the format. And, there's definitely already great cards that are, that I see play now that Necrodominance would be good with and against. So who knows? Like, we could see this card, potentially take over the Modern format. But yeah, that's Necrodominance. There's another enchantment that is pretty interesting. And it kind of, the more I think about it, like the more it could potentially see some play in the format. It's a card called Birthing Ritual. So Birthing Ritual is 1 and a green for an enchantment that says at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature, look at the top 7 cards of your library. Then you may sacrifice a creature. If you do, you may put a creature card with mana value X or less from among them onto the battlefield, where X is plus 1 plus the sacrifice creature's mana value. Put the rest on the bottom library in a random order. So this kind of plays like Birthing Pod, and kind of how Birthing Pod decks would play out. It was like you would just play a bunch of creatures that you were kind of fine with sacrificing. You'd play like Birds of Paradises and Noble Hierarchs, and you would get to turn those into 2-mana creatures. Then like your 2-mana creatures would turn into something like a 3-mana creature like Kitchen Finks, and then you could sacrifice Kitchen Finks to go into 4. Kitchen Finks will come back because of its own trigger. And then you just kind of got to go off from there and, do your whole, what they call a pod chain. The reason why that was very good is because Pod just let you search your library for a card that with, mana value 1 plus the sacrifice creature's value. Birthing Ritual is restricting you to the top 7 cards, and you can only do this if you control a creature as well. So while Birthing Pod, I think you could go where you had to play a bunch of like 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, so you could go and get, or you had to play a bunch of 1, 2, 3, 4 creatures, so you could get 2, 3, 4, 5. Birthing Ritual to me kind of screams like it wants to play at a more like low to the ground, some like decently high impact cards where I think you want to play a lot of 1s, 2s, and 3s, so you can get access to 2s, 3s, and 4s. And again, like being able to play creatures that you are able to kind of get, like assuming that you're not able to manipulate the top of your deck and be able to abuse, the fact that you could have like a pod chain like you did with, regular Birthing Pod or like Vannifar or whatever, that you want to build kind of a more low to the ground, like these creatures are going to do something when they die, whether they're going to come back from the graveyard, like if they have Undying or Persist, or if they're going to say like when this dies, do X, or, you want creatures that are going to enter the battlefield and they're going to draw cards, they're going to get you some kind of value, they're going to kill something, what have you. And I think Birthing Ritual is in that weird spot where kind of like Ugin's Labyrinth and Phyrexian Tower, this is either going to be super busted and it's going to be a great card, or it's going to do virtually nothing. And I think for the people that like playing Birthing Pod, that this might be a card that is worth kind of trying out. Again, just being able to, you look at 7 cards, if you have a creature, and then you can sacrifice any of your creatures to then put a creature from among them onto the battlefield, as long as the creature's value that you're putting into play is X plus 1 of the sacrifice creature. Some other things that you could do that are not directly like inherent with the card, like you could look at the top 7 cards. All right, you look at the top 7, and then if you do, from the way I understand Birthing Ritual, if you look at the top 7 and you have a creature and you choose not to, I don't believe you have to put them back. So it's because it's like you put the rest on the bottom, so maybe they go on the bottom anyway. Like, this is ways that you can kind of get rid of some other cards and stuff. Like, Birthing Ritual is definitely weird. There's not too much that you can do to, like, abuse it, aside from, again, kind of packing your deck with cards that are going to want to be sacrificed, and then having enough of those cards in, like, your mana curve to where you're going to want to play them without Birthing Ritual, and then when you have Birthing Ritual, just being able to do it. With this, aside from, like, Necrodominance, where it is legendary, Birthing Ritual is not, so you're able to kind of have multiples in play where you can trigger 1, look at the top 7, sacrifice a 2, go get a 3. And then on the second Birthing Ritual, you can look at those 7. And if you have a 4 in there, then you can sacrifice that 3 and go get you a 4. So, like, there's where you can kind of get going like crazy. I think one Birthing Ritual is just like okay. I think when you start getting 2 and you start looking at, over 20, probably at about like 20% of your deck, I guess over 20% because 15 would be 20%. When you're looking at like over 20% of your deck, and then probably by the time you get to that point in the game where you have 2 Birthing Rituals in play, you have like probably 40 cards in your deck or less than 40 cards and you're looking at 14, you're looking at pretty close to half of your deck. So, I mean, Birthing Ritual, again, probably falls in that category of it could be busted or it could just be absolutely dog shit. So, we'll kind of see as it goes, but I think Birthing Ritual does kind of have more potential than I gave it credit for in the beginning. I don't think it's going to be absolutely insane, but it does have the potential to be kind of a busted card in the format. Kind of continuing on with the trend of cards in MH3 that are kind of these retrains and pseudo-ish reprints of some older cards in Magic's history, we have Chthonian Nightmare, which is a 2-mana black enchantment that when it enters the battlefield, you get 3 energy counters. Then you may pay X energy, sacrifice a creature, and return the Nightmare to your hand to return target creature card with mana value X from your graveyard to the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery. This is a reprint, kind of like an energy kind of reprint for the card Recurring Nightmare, which is, for the formats like pre-modern, it's a pretty cool card. It's a lot of fun watching like Recurring Nightmare kind of go off, and it can be kind of annoying because Recurring Nightmare just never really goes away. That version of the card being 3 mana and just having to sacrifice a creature to get a creature back from the graveyard. It's like kind of a way that you can loop creatures with some good enter the battlefield triggers. Like in pre-modern, there's like I think it's like Deranged Hermit or whatever, makes like squirrels or whatever, and you're just kind of able to cycle like Deranged Hermit and like some other creatures to get some good enter the battlefield abilities, draw cards and whatnot. This one is obviously a little bit more balanced because you have to pay energy. So you have to find ways to kind of pay energy and then get it back in some way. Of course, with all the energy payoffs in MH3, and of course some of the ones that we had up previously in like the Kaladesh sets and like that block and everything like that. It could be kind of easy to generate a ton of mana, or a ton of energy, and just be able to like kind of one shot bring something huge back to the battlefield. We're looking probably somewhere at like 8 energy counters, and of course like sacrificing a creature to do so. And that could definitely be possible. I could see some scenarios like with Chthonian Nightmare and some kind of like white-black kind of centered reanimator deck. We have, one of the priests. I can't remember the exact name, but it's essentially, a reanimation spell like on a creature that you can then unearth for 5 mana and do the same thing to get a creature back. So maybe with the new creature that gives you life and energy when a creature enters the battlefield and you're able to kind of get multiple going, you can kind of play some of these other like small creatures that maybe mill to then end up getting, a decent amount of energy just from creatures entering the battlefield, bringing them back and then using Nightmare to bring back one big creature. Kind of like the power of a card like Recurring Nightmare compared to like Chthonian Nightmare is that Recurring Nightmare, obviously you just get whatever creature that you want back, but you're able to get like so much value off of those creatures. And with Nightmare, you're definitely going to be leaning more towards, if you're not really producing too much energy, where you kind of have a little bit in your deck, you're looking to kind of maybe get some small creatures back to get some like incremental value that way to kind of make some of your more annoying 1 and 2 mana creatures a little bit more annoying. Again, and like with this bouncing itself as well, you're able to like start to like store up energy as well. So even if you're like getting back, sacrificing a 1 mana creature to get back a 1 mana creature, well, you're netting 2 energy from that. So then when you play Chthonian Nightmare next turn, you're going to have 5 energy, potentially more, again, with any other energy payoffs that you might have. So while this card does take a little bit more to get going than Recurring Nightmare, because a Recurring Nightmare you just immediately put into play, and as long as you've already discarded or one of your big creatures got destroyed, what have you, you're just able to kind of loop it back, and every time that you have a creature, you're essentially going to be able to make this creature for 3 mana. And while the Nightmare, at least for the bigger costed creatures, anything really more than 3, because with Nightmare, as long as it's a CMC 3 or less, you're going to be able to pay enough energy to end up getting it back as long as you have a creature. So if you want bigger creatures to get back, you're going to have to loop Nightmare a little bit more to be able to get to have enough energy to kind of get those bigger creatures back. But from where I could see this card being really good, and the fact that we've had years and years and years of Magic cards and like basically creature power creep, since the times of recurring Nightmare, Chthonian Nightmare just looping 2 and 3 mana creatures can be still very powerful to do, especially if you're just playing like something very mana dork intensive, where you're playing like 4 to 6 dorks or something like that, and like creatures that want to die. You can definitely use that to your advantage with a repeatable sack outlet, albeit even for just 2 mana in Chthonian Nightmare. So really sweet card, really cool design. I don't know if it necessarily, I guess it fixes like being able to get 5, 6, 7, 8 mana creatures on like turn 2. Could you imagine being able to like play any creature on turn 1 on turn 1 and then Nightmare on 2 and then just get back, like an Atraxa or something like that. Like there's definitely scenarios that you could create with that. So this being kind of a fixed version, if you're only going to be doing this, you're going to have to be prioritizing smaller creatures until you get bigger creatures back. But if you want to then just kind of like loop the smaller creatures and stuff like that, you'll net a little bit of energy over time that way. So that's Chthonian Nightmare. Let's go ahead and take a look at another classic card reprinted in a way to be able to enjoy it in the modern format. So next here, we have the card Primal Prayers, which draws a lot of similarities to the card Allurin, which I will hopefully have both of them thrown up here as kind of a side-by-side, and that with all the other ones as well. But Allurin is a very powerful Magic card. For the same cost as Primal Prayers, you got to cast a creature with converted mana cost 3 or less, and do so as though it had flash. Now, that was every player was able to do that when Allurin was in play, so it was balanced, I guess, in that way. But Primal Prayers, of course, has like kind of the new Magic templating that we're used to seeing, where if you play it, you're the only person that is going to be able to perform that action. So with Primal Prayers, same mana cost as Allurin, 2 and double green. It's an enchantment. Enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy counters, and you may cast spells with mana value 3 or less by paying an energy counter rather than paying their mana cost. If you cast a spell this way, you may cast it as though it had flash. So you're essentially getting that Allurin effect. It's one-sided, but you need to spend energy counters to be able to cast those things. And while it is kind of a card that needs a little bit going its way, you need to be able to produce energy unless you just somehow have a 2-card creature combo that you can put into play with Primal Prayers. And, I think that's where, we're going to see where this deck could potentially be broken, where if you're able to, have just a 2-card creature combo where you don't need to play any other energy producers, aside from something like Primal Prayers, and then you're able just to kind of like splinter twin into a win with like a 2-card creature combo. With the restriction being mana value 3 or less, it's going to be a little bit harder to do so, but outside of that, in a realistic way that this deck could be built is by playing some creatures that give you energy either when they enter the battlefield or when other things enter the battlefield, or even when permanents leave the battlefield, and just be able to kind of snowball some kind of advantage. If you're able to loop something like Rogue Refiner to like get energy and then draw a card, and then you're able to kind of play another creature and like bounce it back to your hand and then play it again, draw a card, and just kind of like loop through your deck and then draw a bunch of cards until you find some other creatures to like put you in maybe in a little bit better of a position, or find ways again to just kind of like blink out permanents to then get generate more energy. The fact that you get to do these things at instant speed kind of creates some awkward scenarios, especially, again, with some very powerful creatures, 3 or less, that have some really, really good ETBs that can kind of mess with your opponent's game plan. Being able to do that at instant speed, without the use of like something like Aether Vial is, it's not nothing. Primal Prayers, drawing the similarities that it does to Allurin, I believe it's just basically as direct and almost as blatant as it could be without, actually being, the name of the card. So I think there's some pretty sweet combo potential with this card. That's kind of what Magic has kind of leaned to the most, is some very powerful, like 2 and 3 card combos. And I could see Primal Prayers plus, some amount of like energy producing creatures, if you can find ways to kind of loop 2 creatures and generate energy that way and kind of like keep looping them, potentially just drawing cards, setting yourself up to have like the perfect like 7-card hand to be able to then like combo and win that way, sort of like how Yawgmoth can win, where you're looking for like Quarter Calling or something like that, and you can end up like courting for a creature that's going to end up like winning you the game. You're definitely incentivized to build around with like a lot of creatures with mana value 3 or less, and just so you can get the value off of it. And if you end up just playing this and then putting 3 CMC creatures into play, you end up just making your mana back on primal prayers and stuff, and then some. So interesting to see where this goes. It's, again, very powerful card, very powerful effect. Can be very abusable, as we've seen with, Allurin decks in Legacy's history. So will this break Modern? Probably not, but I could see some new archetypes kind of spanning from Primal Prayer. So pretty sweet card. And I think that's really going to do it for the kind of like callbacks on certain cards. I think that a lot of them are done very nicely. I think they read powerful, but I don't think they're actually like busted in the sense that they're just going to absolutely take over the format like day one of Modern Horizons 3 releases. So I think some pretty cool cards, some interesting build arounds, could spawn some new archetypes. There's definitely a few where I could see them slotting into current archetypes of the Modern format. So I think Modern Horizons 3 so far doing its job in terms of bringing some new life into the Modern format. Not that it really needs it, but injecting new cards into the Modern format while also, beefing up some of the other existing archetypes while creating some of its own along the way. So, there's one more card I want to look at, and I think it's probably maybe not the most interesting one, but it is definitely the card that I think on its face could potentially be one of the more playable cards in the format, like right off the jump. So the last card we have is Harbinger of the Seas. It is a 1 and double blue 2/2 Merfolk Wizard that says non-basic lands are islands. So we know that Blood Moon is a very powerful effect. It's been a very powerful effect through Modern's history forever, really since the inception of the format. Turns out when you play a card that messes with the main engine of the game, the reason why you can play your spells, activate abilities, or whatnot, by just absolutely messing with your opponent's colors of mana and punishing them for playing a better mana base so they can actually afford to cast those spells and everything like that, is a very good effect. And here lately, where we turn non-basic lands into mountains, and decks were mostly non-red, and like the red cards they played, like the removal was mainly like the removal, some of the creatures and whatnot, kind of whatever. Now we're at a point where the red removal is very good, and people are more playing, like Magus of the Moon over something like a Blood Moon type effect, or I guess just Blood Moon period. And, we have Unholy Heat, Lightning Bolt seeing a lot of play. We have Ragavan, all these different things where we can like either create treasure tokens to kind of find a way to get around, having only islands or mountains, and, just in that way having very powerful spells in those colors anyway that people already want to play to kind of take over in that spot. Harbinger of the Seas, arguably to me, is a better card than Blood Moon is currently, and kind of for the reasons that I mentioned. While blue does have some very powerful effects, if you just shut your opponent completely out of like red mana and they're stuck with all islands, for one, the easiest place that this slots into is like the Merfolk deck. Play like 1 or 2 copies of this, or maybe even 4 if you just want to like try to get your opponent. Maybe if you're like Merfolk, this is kind of like on their radar, but outside of, if you're just like a blue kind of like control deck, wants to play a little bit slower of a game, then you can just, get your opponent with this. They're stuck on all blue mana. For some decks like that, they just absolutely can't operate, just like how Blood Moon decks would kind of just hose like things like Jund back in the day. This could just easily do like the same thing and then some to your opponents and just make them completely unable to interact, where I think red was a more likely a color where like, okay, we could play some kind of magic, if we never draw basics. And I think for a lot of decks, like they are relying on a lot of non-basic lands, so we're like, if you drew a forest in Jund and you had a bunch of mountains, you could at least play Ren at 6. and you could potentially get back some other lands. You could cycle some lands or whatever. Potentially find ways to draw extra cards to kind of get out of this, where, you know, now if you're stuck with a bunch of islands and you draw a forest in Jund, well, guess what? You're just on green mana, and then you're on a bunch of blue mana that, like, you really can't do things with. So I think this easily being the one that slots in to a decent amount of decks in the format, I think arguably is a better effect than something like Blood Moon, you know, where I think islands are more beneficial to give your opponent than mountains, more so for the fact that, you know, again, messing with someone's mana base, and I don't think a lot of the blue decks, you know, can play a ton of cantrips, but they can potentially, like, find their basics and stuff that way. But I think I'd rather them, like, play a bunch of, like, cantrips and whatnot, especially if I'm merfolk. I'm fine with them, like, playing cantrips rather than, you know, being able to find answers, or they're stuck looking for, like, their 1 or 2, like, lands in their deck, in their, like, 60-card deck. So this card is, you know, probably as a surprise to no one, is very good. It is a very powerful effect. It has always been a very powerful effect throughout Modern's history, and I see Harbinger of the Seas, you know, seeing some play where, like, the only real downside to it is the fact that it is double blue. You know, aside from that, you know, it has everything else going for it, and, you know, I definitely don't look forward to playing against this card, being the Yawgmoth player, but nonetheless, you know, it's still going to be a player in the format. And now another type of effect that we have to kind of be on the look for. I don't know if Modern necessarily needed this effect, but, you know, people have been kind of, you know, asking and stuff where we kind of have, like, Urborg turns everything into swamps, you know, and then we got, like, Yavimaya to, you know, turn a bunch of things into forests. Now we have Harbinger of the Seas, where Blood Moon turns non-basics into mountains. We have something that turns non-basics into islands. So just kind of, I think, a natural step in design for a Magic card, and, you know, probably not. I mean, I think better than Blood Moon, but maybe not necessarily the worst thing in the world. But, you know, I'm kind of left asking myself if we needed this kind of effect in the format. So that's Harbinger of the Seas. That's going to do it for me in this video. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed it. This is kind of like my breakdown analysis on some of the cards that I'm excited for in Modern Horizons 3. There's some other cards, you know, if we want more videos like this and all that, you, of course, you got to leave a like on the video, you know, comment down below, like, cards that you want me to talk about in the Modern format that's going to be coming out in Modern Horizons 3. You know, I would definitely like to see kind of what y'all are excited for, because, I mean, like I said, these are the cards that I'm mainly excited for. There's some other cards as well, but this is where the ones I thought met, like, interesting, like, could see play and whatnot, to, you know, just being enjoyable cards that could create some nice play patterns and stuff. So that's going to be me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed. Again, if you liked the video, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what card you're excited for in Modern Horizons 3. Subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, all that fun stuff. And that's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.